Should be ready to go.
Great. Well, welcome to our first Fridays with a Forester of 2022. We did this last year and it was very successful. We didn't have a lot of time to promote Matt's first lesson here on carbon, but on February 18th, but we're glad he's here. So his topic today is questions to ask your forester about forest carbon. That's a hot topic right now, is carbon in forest. And actually, I talked to some of our farmer groups that they're actually experiencing some opportunities with carbon sequestration and carbon credits in the agricultural landscape as well. So this is a very hot topic on all landscapes. Matt Russell's part of our forestry team and extension, and also based out of our St. Paul campus in the Department of Forest Resources. We do have a chat, and there's no question and answer bar, but a chat bar if you want to enter your chat during the presentation that Matt's presenting. All these will be recorded on the Z link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. And Matt, you can share your screen. I'll stop.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary. Before we get started, I did want to just launch a quick poll just to see who's in the crowd tonight, or tonight. Gosh, it's still just 9 o'clock in the morning, not 9 o'clock at night. So yeah, so there should be a poll open that you should see. Just interested to know if you're a landowner interested in enrolling your land in a forest carbon market. All right, I think that's just about everyone. I'll give it just another couple of seconds. Good, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. So I know many of you may not be landowners, but are interested in learning more. And so it sounds like at least 3 of you are not landowners, but are here anyway to learn about carbon markets. And one of you says maybe. And so good to see that. Good to see people interested, even though they may not own land, about carbon markets. So what I'm going to present today, I'll go ahead and stop sharing that. The first thing I'll do is I'm going to share just the slides that I'm going to be going through. And I put a link there in chat. If you want, you can click on that link and follow along with me. Otherwise, click on it and then kind of leave it in the background. Now, one thing that I do have are a lot of links, especially to many of the different carbon programs. And so rather than try to write down all those web URLs that can be pretty cumbersome, you could also just click on that link that I shared in chat. And from there, everything is hyperlinked that you can access really easily. So a couple of ways to access some of the information that I'll be sharing here in the next couple of minutes. I don't have a lot. I have 10 slides. And so I know those of you that maybe attended these last year know that we really like these to be very much open Q&A. Spend a lot of time talking about answering questions and getting feedback from you all about what's going on, what questions you have, what opportunities are there for you, and try to do our best to answer those. So I have 2 other of my extension colleagues, both Gary Wyatt and Jeff Jackson online too, not to put them to work to help answer questions, but if things do come up, we can certainly always ask around. So just one second while I orient things here. Great. So for my 10 slides, the first one, obviously we're here to learn about carbon markets. And I was thinking about how to frame this in terms of how to talk about it. And I framed it as, what should you be asking your forester about carbon markets? And the reason I framed it that way was that I think that if you decide to get into a carbon market or not, as a landowner, you should really be talking with your forester. And so carbon markets, managing your land to either store carbon or to soak in or sequester carbon should be a part of your management plan. And at least in Minnesota and the Lake States, we often encourage landowners to work with foresters to help develop those plans. And so I really kind of framed this around some questions to ask about carbon markets that your forester should have a good idea about. And to think about, because your forester is one of the persons that best knows your land, they should be able to address any questions you have about the carbon aspects of that as you're thinking about potentially a carbon market program. And so the reason that carbon is of interest to many people is that trees and forests are natural climate solutions. And so all the time, forests are good. Trees are, through the process of photosynthesis, taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and giving out oxygen. You know, that's why plants help us to breathe better, because they provide oxygen to the air. And so a tremendous valuable resource, not only the clean air they provide, but clean water, the recreation opportunities, the ability for wood to provide forest products, and hunting lands and everything we enjoy about the woods. That's why they're really natural solutions to things like climate change. Minnesota itself has done a lot of work in recent years to better understand the role of climate in our forests. The Minnesota Forest Resources Council recently produced an excellent report on climate change and what it means specifically for Minnesota's forest. And so that's a great resource that folks should be aware of. Ongoing right now, the Minnesota DNR, in partner with a lot of other agencies, is undergoing Minnesota's Climate Action Framework. And so a process that's looking at trying to identify, specific to Minnesota, what can Minnesotans be doing to better understand climate change and to integrate that into our daily lives. And so a lot of work going on there relative to Minnesota and climate change. I'll dive right into carbon markets. And so when we talk about carbon markets, there are really two different kinds. And so the first type are compliance markets. And so often these are referred to as regulatory markets as well. And so these are traditionally what people think of as cap and trade. And so what we think about here is if an emitter, typically a company that produces a lot of material and manufacturing or something else, they produce emissions. If they go above some allowable limit, well, they have to buy those emissions credits from somewhere. And then there's this process of trading. If a company emits below some certain amount, then well, they can trade with someone that emits higher. And so they try to kind of even out the emissions that are happening in the world. Now, compliance markets relate to forests in that if you're a landowner, typically you'll enter a contract length of 100 years, sometimes more, for a compliance-driven market. And that's just because compliance markets are more regulatory, and they really want to ensure that there's going to be forest there, for the next century or so. And so historically, compliance markets have really been appealing to large landowners. And so when I say large landowners, I really mean folks with thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And so there's a lot of requirements in terms of the upfront costs to understand how much carbon is in your woods. So we typically need to do a thorough forest inventory, getting out into the woods, measuring the diameters of trees, understanding and counting the species that are in a forest. And so compliance markets have been around for a long time, and they've really been appealing to these larger landowners. More recently, voluntary markets have entered the world, and especially in the last 2 to 3 years. And these voluntary markets have been appealing to a lot of people because they typically offer shorter contract lengths. And so many people, if you're a private landowner, you might be hesitant. I'm not going to be around in 100 years. I can't imagine, trying to, enrolling my land into a long program like that. And so voluntary markets try to take advantage of a shorter commitment. And this is really what makes them appealing for private woodland owners with small properties. Most of the landowners in Minnesota and Wisconsin, are not going to own, a ton of land. There are lots of landowners that own 40, 60, 80 acres that they want to do good things with. And so voluntary markets are really appealing to them. This is a snapshot. This is a kind of a table I try to keep updated as some things change with the markets and who's doing what. So right as of now, there are really 2 of these 4 programs that are active, at least in Minnesota, that I'm aware of. And so those would be the NCX program and the Forest Carbon Works program. And so if you're a landowner, you could reach out to one of these programs and you could get started right away. And so they're kind of currently offering, programs to work with landowners. The other two are still in development, but they're coming pretty soon. The one is called the Family Forest Carbon Program, and that's a program by the American Forestry Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. They've done a pilot program in Pennsylvania and West Virginia to date, and they're having their program coming to the upper Great Lakes, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, I think by later this year. And so that's one to definitely keep in mind. The other one is by a company, the company is called Finite Carbon. The Forest Carbon Program is called Core Carbon. And that one also is coming quite soon, at least according to the website that they manage. So all of these are a little bit different. They offer different contract lengths. They have different minimum acreage that are required in the program. Some allow harvesting, some don't. And all of them are kind of unique in their own ways in terms of how to enroll landowners. And so there are links to each of these programs. Most of these programs also have an email list. And so you can sign up for their email list to better understand, what's new, what's oncoming with the program. And so I encourage you, if you're interested in these, to sign up for those email lists from these different carbon programs. In terms of the theme of the webinar here this morning is really to ask your forester a series of questions about, whether or not carbon markets are a right fit for your land. And so here are a few that you might start with. The first of all is the contract length. And so landowners are often interested, in, what is that contract length? And, what are my roles and responsibilities as a landowner during the contract from which I'm going to be managing my woods for carbon? And so it's important to understand that and to do that from the outset. Many landowners like to harvest timber, but obviously if we harvest timber, then we're taking away some of the carbon stocks in that forest. And all of those carbon stocks might be going to wood products that might actually continue to store that carbon. So sometimes it's hard to account for that. And what does that mean in terms of the overall carbon flux or the changes in the carbon amounts in a forest? And so it's good to understand, how is that, if it's allowed, what are the regulations around that, and what are the policies? Some programs have costs, these, to enroll people, it takes staff time and effort. And so, might be concerned about whether the cost to enroll. And then what are the other responsibilities do I have in terms of, payment of your taxes and some of the other things. And so here's a couple of questions you might kind of start with asking your forester about some of the carbon programs that might be available. Another one is what's called stacking. And so this is something that, depending on the carbon program, and I'm not sure specific for the, the four that I listed exactly, what if stacking is allowed or not. And so the question you might ask your forester is, can I stack my payments with other landowner payments? So what do I mean by that? So as an example, Minnesota has a Sustainable Forest Incentive Act, or SFIA. And so when you enter your land into SFIA, you receive a payment agreeing not to develop on your land. And so you can choose your covenant length as a landowner. And so it could be as short as 8 years or as long as 50 years. So say you chose an 8-year covenant length, you could receive, if you're a small landowner, less than 1,900 acres, you could receive $9.71 an acre as a part of that tax incentive program. And so the question is, well, if you're receiving payment for carbon from a carbon market, can you also receive the payment for being in a tax incentive program? And so that's a good question for your forester and for others. Another one is cost share. The Minnesota DNR has a number of cost share. SWCD often they have cost share. EQIP is a popular one at the federal level that many landowners use. Can you receive cost share monies and be enrolled in the carbon program? So you're certainly a good question to ask. And then also, if you are in one of those, what are the focuses? Is there implications of harvesting timber? And so what might that mean for this kind of landowner payment stacking, which would be a good question for your forester. And another thing is, what's going to happen if the property is sold? Certainly as landowners, we like to we in Extension like to tell landowners to be proactive in terms of understanding what your future goals are, 5 years, 10 years from now. But life happens and things change. And so if the property is sold, is the land still tied in that carbon market? And what are the rules and regulations if it's a different owner, but it's the same property? And so this is definitely something that you want to be aware of before you enter into any carbon market and before you really start thinking about signing on the dotted line for anything. And so many of them are different in terms of how they approach land sales that are under land sales for properties that are enrolled in a specific carbon market. And my last slide, and this is really the big thing, is if you don't have a forester, we encourage you to get one. And so this is a great resource, z.umn.edu/find-a-forester. And that link will take you to our tool that looks at, it provides a map. The DNR hosts a map on their website to find a forester. And so they're separated by geographic region. And so every pin is a forester. And so we've got over 100 of them here in Minnesota that can help you with your needs. And so the different colors represent the different kinds of foresters. Some of these are DNR foresters, some are industry foresters, some are SWCD foresters, some consultants. And so there's lots of options depending on where you live and depending on kind of what your goals are. Foresters can help. And so my last kind of concluding thought is that reach out to a forester that might be able to help you to kind of navigate through these carbon markets to understand if they're right for you. And that's all I had. I'll stop sharing my screen here in a minute and be happy to take any questions that might be out there and to have some discussion. If you do have questions even after today, my email is there, russellm@umn.edu. Really encourage you as well, if you don't receive it, our My Minnesota Woods email. And so our My Minnesota Woods email goes out on the second Tuesday of every month. And so it has a lot of information about upcoming events that we host in Extension, other organizations host that we think are appealing to forest landowners, that are appealing to really anyone that enjoys trees and forests. And so definitely sign up for that email if you don't receive it. And that's really the best way to hear about what we're doing in Extension and to hear about things like carbon markets and other things. And so with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and be happy to take any questions that might be out there.
So you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you like. We don't have any chats, questions in chat, Matt, but you want to maybe talk about your reference. Jeff and I were chatting together here. If you didn't download Matt's slides, you can actually download those or click on the chat and then upload those on your computer and then save them as another file. I think you can download and so forth, right, Matt?
Yeah, you should be able to, after clicking that link and then going, I think for me, it's you go over to file in the top left and then download, and you can download them like as a PDF. That might be helpful to you.
There's a question from Randy. Let's see, do you know what carbon markets that allow stacking of payments?
Yeah, good question, Randy. I'm aware of, I'll go ahead and share my screen again. So Randy, the two that are currently enrolling landowners in Minnesota both allow stacking of tax incentive payments in addition to payments for carbon. And so that would be the NCX program and then the Forest Carbon Works program. And so for their concerns, they don't really, I don't think, they're focused on the carbon benefits and they're not necessarily concerned so much with what you receive as a landowner. That's obviously a good benefit to you because you could receive a couple of payments for basically the not enrolling in the carbon market and not developing your land as an example. And so the two programs that are active in Minnesota both allow stacking of both of the tax incentive program payment in addition to some of the carbon market payments.
Good question from Marge. Can cities participate in these tax incentive programs? For example, Oakdale has a couple of 100 acres of nature preserve.
Mhm. It's a good question, Marge. Yeah, I know. I know for the SFIA program, it's really focused on private landowners, and so I don't know that municipalities would benefit from the tax incentive payment, um, unless it's privately owned land. Um, so yeah, that would be a good question, and I do wonder. We could put you in contact with someone that might have some more other places to look. But yeah, at least for SFIA, it's focused only on private landowners.
Man, I had a question for rural areas. We have a lot of landowners that may have river bottoms and maybe real narrow woodlands around creeks or streams or waterways. Can those qualify for these credits as well?
They can. Yeah, I mean, any forest that's growing and sequestering carbon is generally eligible, depending on the program. I know for some programs, certainly the minimum acres required is a thing for some programs. And so, if you've got, if it's river bottom land, but you've got, if it's a narrow stretch of land, but it's contiguous and it's, of a size that's going to be appealing to some of these programs, then yeah, that they could still be eligible. So yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Yeah, I think we have a lot of farmers that are in western Minnesota, southwestern Minnesota, that might have some eligible woodlands that are on river bottoms that can't be obviously crop farmed, so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So an interesting thing I learned this week, one of our past associates, some of you probably know him, Mike Reichenbach, but he retired about a year ago from Extension, but now he is certified for the NCX program to be a forester, to go out to land and help to get it certified and into the program. But Matt, I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how NCX calculates the carbon stored. They've just got such an interesting program where it's only a 1-year contract length. And I mean, that seems like it could be pretty appealing to landowners.
Yeah, it's a good point. Before I answer that, John, I just mentioned to Marge that John Carlson at the Minnesota DNR, he's our go-to for anything related to the tax incentive programs in Minnesota. So I put his email address there in chat, Marge. That might be able to help you answer your question about Oakdale and your forest there. Yeah, the NCX program, they are very innovative in terms of what they're doing. And so they're actually using a lot of technology to understand forest carbon and how much is out there. And so they've invested a lot into a program that's basically a forest carbon map of the entire United States. And it's built off of a lot of data, a lot of remote sensing data that they're kind of continuing to refine and to update as more data is collected on our forests and as new imagery comes available. And so what they can basically do is find out how much carbon you have by basically drawing your property boundary and basically pulling that out. And they can have a pretty good idea of how much carbon is there. And so really a good investment into the technology that's helping to inform the carbon stored in the NCX's program. Yeah, and like you said, Jeff, the real difference in what they're doing too is it's a 1-year contract length, which you compare to some programs that are 125 years. That can be pretty appealing, especially you're more likely to know you'll be on your property 1 year from now rather than 125 years from now. And so the way that they do that is they actually it's different accounting and different methodology that's currently under review now. But it's kind of this ton year accounting. And so they're kind of quantifying that, how many tons are not going to be harvested over that 1-year span, and they're paying landowners for that, as opposed to kind of thinking about over a 100-year span, how much carbon is going to accrue over that 100 years, rather than just that 1 year. That's not. So yeah, it's a very innovative program. They're changing, getting a lot of people interested in markets because they appeal to such small landowners with short contract lengths. So yeah, it's definitely one that I know is becoming increasingly popular here in Minnesota and the Lake States.
So Matt, another question regarding the NCX. Are you familiar with their payments? So what is it per acre, or what do people get in? And is the contracts like for every year renewable contract, or they get a payment every year, or is it every 5 years and so forth?
Yeah, with NCX, it's an annual program, and so you can do it 1 year, and then my understanding is you can also enroll the next year. So you kind of do it in 1 year steps. Yeah, the prices are up and down kind of every time I look, they seem to be changing. Generally, I mean, historically for the regulatory markets, and that's primarily the program that's run through the California Air Resources Board, they've tended to offer greater payments than some of the voluntary markets, somewhere around, anywhere generally between $20 per acre and about $50 per acre, depending on how much carbon is there. And there's a lot of unknowns about that. And so those kind of tend to offer more payment than the voluntary markets. The voluntary markets, I think, generally are shorter contract lengths, smaller acres. And so generally for those voluntary markets, it's, around $10 an acre, plus or minus, $5 to $10 per acre. So it can be pretty variable in terms of what folks are seeing for the voluntary markets, especially in the last 2 years, as there's been a lot more interest in this. It's kind of done some interesting things with the supply and demand of the different carbon that's accessible in those different markets.
Interesting. Anyone else have a question?
Gary brought my attention to a brand new program. I'm going to post something in the chat here, and this is going. So I put in a link for the All Acres for Our Water. It's a pilot program in Stearns County. But this is kind of something for landowners even beyond carbon markets. So it's a pilot program. This is very cutting edge, but they're looking at paying landowners for what we call ecosystem services. So that could be different. I think it's mainly for ag land, but it's for different practices that make the water cleaner, make the air cleaner. And I believe it's sequestering carbon too, but it's just something else interesting to watch is that, well, I think the idea is if we want farmers to adopt conservation practices which benefit all of society, say by cleaning up our rivers, then we should be paying them for it. They should have some type of incentive to do these practices that are benefiting everyone. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. It's another kind of up and coming thing to watch along with carbon markets, are these payments for ecosystem services.
Thanks, Jeff, for mentioning those. Yeah, carbon credits, water credits, nitrogen credits, all kinds of credits out there for doing the right thing and actually having landscapes that are going to be valuable for our natural resources. Ecosystem services.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jeff. It seems like a good program they have going there in Stearns County, you said? Yeah. Yeah, and what's driving a lot of this interest in forest carbon and ecosystem services too is a lot from corporations. Corporations want to do good, and there's a rise in environmental, social, and governance investing, or ESG investing, and so people are really looking to forests and waterways, and even farmers when it comes to nitrogen and some of the other important things that even the farmers do, that they're really looking to capitalize on natural capital, things like water and air and forests. So in fact, there was I was just talking about this with someone in a car ride yesterday. If any of you watched the Super Bowl, there was a commercial from Salesforce, which you don't think of as someone that's as a company that does a lot in the environment, but in that commercial, it's Matthew McConaughey. We're fans of Matthew McConaughey in my household. we like all of his movies that he's in. But he's kind of like, he's in a spacesuit and he's like wondering why is all this investment going into outer space? Like, we have a lot of work to do here on Earth is kind of the theme of the commercial. And Salesforce is actually, they've been a big contributor to a lot of venture capital in this space in terms of carbon markets, and they've been a big supporter of the Trillion Tree Initiative, kind of the larger goal to try to plant 1 trillion trees in the next 30 years, I think. So yeah, that's where a lot of this is coming from too. Corporations really are valuing the natural capital, whether it be in forests or water or anything else. And I think, this program that Jeff has mentioned too is kind of a reflection of that as well.
Any more questions for Matt? I think it's a great idea, Matt. You suggested that they could contact these websites that you mentioned, the 4 or 5 that you listed there, and you can get on their email list. I think that's a great idea. If you're interested in looking at that opportunity, then certainly, like you say, things are changing almost daily on these markets and different things. So.
Yeah, I'll make another plug for those email newsletters, and yeah, I'm subscribed to many of them, and many of them are pretty frequent. So if any of you are on social media too, pretty much all of them are, on Facebook and Twitter and different social media. So give them a follow there too, just to hear what they're up to, how they're enrolling landowners in their programs.
Marge said, glad to join this meeting when I can, and thank you for setting these up. You're welcome, Marge. Yeah, we thought we'd continue this Zoom. We think that's kind of a positive result of COVID is Zoom meetings, and people don't have to travel with $3.50 gas or whatever it is. And yeah, you can sit at home and in your den or your kitchen and watch some of these educational programs and get more information. More questions. We'll probably start closing here pretty soon, but yeah, certainly ask Matt any more questions. And then as you close today, there'll be an evaluation that pops up on your screen, and certainly put some evaluation comments about our Fridays with a Forester. Oh, and there's Matt's email, russellm@umn.edu. Well, Matt, shall I share a screen and start closing here?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Yeah, again, if you have questions after the event, yeah, my email is right there. Don't hesitate to reach out. And if we don't know, I'll put you in touch with Jeff or Gary. And if they don't know, then we'll find someone else that knows.
Let's see if I can find the right screen here and share it. There, do you see Matt's picture in front of the tree? Great, Jeff, thank you. Yeah, so thank you for attending today's webinar, and we have some other webinars coming. And let's see if I can advance the slide. So here's our webinars coming up for Fridays with a Forester, and you can certainly sign up for those. I think actually you have signed up for these, so you should get notification on these: wildlife, citizen science, woods and climate, timber sales, and new wood products, forest grazing or silver pasture, and then family earth care. So a lot of good types of programs coming up. So when we close, you'll see a evaluation in your browser, and obviously these are anonymous, so we'd like you to fill those out. And here's some web links that are some of our programs, like Matt mentioned. And yeah, we thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's see, man, looks like a show. You want to stop recording, or do you already do that?